In this recording, I'm going to continue discussing the Cascade model as I have in previous recordings. This one is specific to KPIs. With that in mind, I'll talk first about where KPIs fit in the Cascade model, then I'll identify what KPIs are, and then have a discussion about how to write KPIs in a kind of formulaic way, and then discuss the difference between leading and lagging KPIs. This is the Cascade model, as you're probably familiar with if you've listened to other recordings on it. At the top, we have the mission. I kind of put that in there because they really started with vision, but you need to start with the mission, vision, and then you have values that flow from that vision. And then you have focus areas for growth and opportunity. And then each of those really each of those focus areas should have objectives. And there could be a few objectives, as I'll talk about in a second. Not too many. But then each one will have a KPI associated with it and perhaps numerous projects that are also associated with it. I talk about the projects in another recording. And this is where KPIs fit, of course. And the idea of KPIs, which are key performance indicators, KPI, is they measure your progress toward your objectives. And so you have to know how you're progressing against your goals. And so you need to select, you need to write and be very discreet about the KPIs, what they are, and they have to measure, obviously, what you want them to in terms of those goals. They're also a communication tool for those within the organization. Hopefully, you can create them so they're easily readable in a visual kind of way. A lot of times we associate them with dashboards. We put them in dashboards so that people can readily see how we're progressing against our objectives and goals. So how do we write them? Well, we don't first of all copy them from someone else because they have to be specific to our strategic objectives. And you base your KPIs on value-based decision making versus alternative-based decision making. What does that mean? So alternative is what it sounds like. You're just given a list of alternatives and you select one. So it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of thought process that goes into that selection. So you should do that. You should go in and think about the value that each one delivers and then base your decision on that value and what matters most to the organization. So I use an example, a very simplistic example of ordering coffee at a diner. I haven't been to a diner in years, but this is the idea. Okay. In alternative based, you want coffee, and the waitress asks if you want milk. It's a typical request after you order that. And you ask, well, okay, sure, but what are my choices? Whole milk, skim, or soy? And then without much more thought, you might just select one. That's not adding value in terms of into your decision making. Value based, though, you want coffee. Waitress asks if you want milk, and you think about the value in the coffee. You want it to taste good, but also you want a healthy alternative. So you think about that, and then you weigh your decision based on those particular factors and your choices. So you see how value based kind of goes one step further in terms of putting another attribute in there to try to think about, um, you know, how important is this decision and how important are some of the objectives that I have in mind and how do they match? So in this particular case, you might opt for soy if you don't think it changes the taste much. It's obviously going to be personal. This is how we write KPIs. This is obviously kind of a flow of process. So we determine our strategic objective. So as I mentioned in a couple slides ago, I said, we could have several objectives. So we determine those, and then we define what success would look like, and then decide on the measurement to show how we're making gains, how we're improving that in terms of the success. And then we write our SMART KPIs. Let's start with determining the strategic objective. With this, you're trying to measure something, and you will have, as I mentioned, several strategic objectives. Generally recommended to have 3 to 5. You don't want too many because that's kind of defeating the purpose. A strategic plan is to give you strategy and movement in certain directions, and not too many, because then there is no focus. And that's not a good thing for the organization, because first of all, you don't have enough resources to meet too many priorities, and then it doesn't give people a clear path, who are either in the organization or stakeholders outside the organization. So each one of these particular objectives will have at least one KPI. There could be several KPIs, and there could be so many KPIs that you'd have to narrow them down and just pick a couple that you think best match your measurement of progression against a goal. So I looked at Cleveland Clinic's focus areas in their strategic plan in 2020, and they had elicited uh, had um, listed a few. Right, these were those: doubling the number of patients served. It's a lot. Serving as lifelong partners to patients, engaging caregivers as members of teams, embracing digital tools to enhance the patient and caregiver experience, and optimizing resources as stewards of the organization. So you see, they have five, so pretty much in the recommended area. So if we look at one, doubling the number of patients served, we could say, okay, so this is a focus area by 2022. Of course, that was the 2020 strategic plan, but they go out maybe sometimes 3 to 5 years. So if they wanted to double it by 2022, how do we do that? Well, they have to have objectives to meet that focus area. And some of those objectives could be updating some existing facilities to increase volume or to enhance efficiency so that the throughput is higher given the footprint of that facility. Or we could build some new facilities. How do we define success? There could be many options for your metric, as I mentioned, but you need to think about what matters most and how each measurement is, which one is the best in terms of getting to that particular objective or progression against that objective. So is updating of an existing facilities, what does that mean? Is that the number of facilities? And when do we consider it complete? When we cut the ribbon, when we see our first patient, when contractors are finished? So even with something simple like updating existing facilities and the number of facilities, you have to be specific about that because there could be a lot of um, different opinions based on when something is finished. So we decide on our measurement. So is the number of facilities is our measurement, and what do we consider to be that? And then we write our SMART KPIs. SMART, of course, we probably looked at this in HR as well because we have SMART goals. Those are usually, personal or professional development goals. So S for SMART, SMART specific, state what you'll do and use action words. M is measurable, talked about measurement. Provide a way to evaluate, use metrics. A is achievable within your scope. So you want something that, you want a goal that's reachable, not something that's unattainable. R is relevant. Make sure it's within the area that you need and make sure it's relevant to that objective. And T is time bound by a specific period in time. So you write your KPIs as outlined in our Cascade model with action plus detail plus value plus deadline. So for our Cleveland Clinic example, open 2 expanded facilities to patient appointments by June 2022. So we have the action open. The detail is 2 expanded facilities. Um, and what's the value? Well, patient appointments. And what's the deadline? June 2022. So we define what that detail and value are. As I mentioned in the just the agenda for this particular recording, I talked about having leading and lagging KPIs. So a leading KPI is an indicator, is a measurable factor that changes before the company starts to follow a particular pattern. These leading KPIs are used to predict changes in the company, but they are not always accurate. So examples of leading KPIs for an organization or company's future growth is percent of growth in sales pipeline. So the sales pipeline is, if you're selling maybe equipment or something like that to hospitals, and that's a long sales cycle. So you'll have things in the pipeline. So yeah, this, they're working on that. We've answered an RFP and they're going through that process. And, you generally have an idea of how many you could win. And you say, okay, so these particular hospitals are in the pipeline. Of course, we don't know if they're going to hit or at the rate that we would expect them to, or percent of growth in new markets, number of new patients, the number of new website trials, number of unique website views. See how these really don't necessarily flow to our bottom line. Like, what's our revenue? What's our reimbursements? These are leading to that. So hence why they're leading key performance indicators. A lagging one is a measurable fact. It records the actual performance of an organization. Lagging indicators usually include the following: annual sales, growth in annual sales, gross margin, EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and that's a measure of profitability. Annual net income, growth in annual net income. So these are facts. They're mostly financial ones. You could have other ones, um, but mostly we're focusing on these types of key performance indicators. And that concludes this recording on the Cascade model and KPIs, or key performance indicators.